Namaste. Welcome to Our Planet in Perspective. In today's episode, we will be in conversation with climate activists from around the globe. Our guest for today's episode, Dr. Kamrul Hossain. He is a research professor and director of the Northern Institute for Environmental and Minority Law at the Arctic Center.
When we talk about international environmental laws, what do you think are the gaps that you can see?
It is a very dynamic field. There are new situations emerging every time, so you have to address those situations. Shipping, for example, is one of the things that is emerging in the Arctic. So the gap was that there were no concrete regulations focusing the Arctic concerning shipping. But in 2007, Polar Code was adopted, and Polar Code was specifically applicable to the ice-covered waters. So that applies to Arctic, and that is about regulating not only the pollution control issues, discharge, for example, from the vessels, and also it's about operation of shipping and what kind of ships, for example, ice class vessels. So what kind of vessels you need for the Arctic. So that problem, for example, addressed by Polar Code, but then again heavy fuel was not kind of regulated by Polar Code. That means that is a gap there. So that brings more greenhouse gas emissions, and that is problematic for the Arctic because that Arctic is melting faster, and global change or environment temperature rise in the Arctic is said that 4 times faster than the global average.
Your field of expertise also focuses on human rights law. So can you tell us something about the situation of human rights law when it comes to the indigenous people living in the Arctic region?
Human rights law evolved actually after the creation of the United Nations. First, actually, Human Rights Institute is called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted in 1948. Thereafter, there were, but this declaration is not binding. It's kind of, it has a normative significance. But this declaration did not talk about indigenous people. There was no reference to indigenous people. Then there were negotiations going on, and 1996 there were 2 international legally binding covenants or legally binding law. International law was adopted in regard to human rights law, which are called International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. None of the convention referred to indigenous people. So indigenous people's rights were not included within the mainstream human rights law. This is called mainstream human rights law, or this is called actually International Bill of Human Rights, where Universal Declaration of Human Rights and with 2 covenants I referred to. But then there was an article in International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27. It says that in those countries where ethnic minorities are living, then states have the obligation to protect their culture, their language, and their belief system, religious activities and that kind of things. In most of the countries where indigenous people are living, they are minorities. So this article is applied for indigenous people when we talk about indigenous people's human rights. These articles are interpreted to protect indigenous people's rights. But problem is that indigenous peoples very wide, because their rights are rights in terms of culture. I mean, indigenous people's rights in terms of culture is very wide. So what does culture mean? I mean, what elements are included within the culture? So you need interpretation. Then there are human rights monitoring bodies within these conventions or covenants. So human rights monitoring body interpreted that indigenous people's rights are covered by, for example, Article 27 of the ICCP, or International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And by culture, it means that it has a broad meaning, that fishing, hunting, other traditional form of activities, reindeer herding, for example, for Arctic indigenous people like in the Nordic countries, caribou herding in Canadian Arctic indigenous people, even fishing on the ice, frozen ice in the sea. These are part of their culture, and this culture has to be protected. So these are the issues that we address when we talk about indigenous people's human rights in Arctic, but that applies also in other regions of the countries. For example, in third pole region, Himalayan region, yak herding could be considered as culture of indigenous people. So if there are intervention, they could seek protection from the regulation that we have in place. But there are other legal instruments also that apply to indigenous peoples. For example, ILO Convention 169, which gives protection and which is the only legally binding convention or legally binding instrument that applies to indigenous people. Unfortunately, the ratification history is very poor in that convention. Most of the countries where indigenous people are living did not ratify this convention. Only 23 countries so far ratified this convention. In most of those countries, indigenous people are majority, they are not minority. But then UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was adopted in 2007, was a groundbreaking development. Again, it is a declaration, it's not legally binding, but it gives normative significance to protect indigenous people's rights. For example, there are provisions in the declarations. In many places it says that the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous people should be adopted or should be kind of contingent in regard to the development or whatever activities that are of indigenous people's concern on their land, on their territories. And this principle or this norm endorsed in the declaration does not give any legally binding force, but on the other hand, national courts like in Peru or in other South American countries, in their judicial institutions, they were including or they were referring to these provisions, so giving binding force of the provisions even though they are not legally binding.
We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, hope you have a great week ahead. Namaste.